This is lab 2. In this lab, we are going to primarily work with what is called string. So strings are basically a data type in Java that is used to hold textual information such as sentences, words, etc. So strings in Java are implemented as objects. So we've already have learned about objects in our theory class. So I'll only be covering the aspects of string that we'll need to complete this lab. So with that out of the way, let's start. So the first task is to input a word. So input a word into a string, print the length of the word, that is how many characters or symbol spaces are there. So basically, as you can see, I've already created a file here named lab2. It's here, and let me start this worksheet. So as usual, let me create a method. Let's name it task1 so that I can write the code for task1 here. So my first task is to take an input from the user. So before I do that, I'll obviously have to import scanner from java.util. Okay. So now let's create a scanner object. Let's name this KB. And now I'm going to take an input. So just like so this is how I was previously taking integer inputs from the keyboard, right? Well, now I want to take a string input. So I'll type the variable. So I'll type the data type here followed by an identifier. So let's call this input, or just let's say str, or string in short. And then I'll use my scanner object. But this time, this is a different method, right? I'm not going to be accepting integer inputs from the user. Instead, I'm going to be accepting string input. So to accept a string input, you need to use a method that's named next. Okay. So now, let's first just try and print out this input. Okay. So let's run this program. As you already know, Sublime, from Sublime Text, I cannot have my program accept inputs, so I'm manually compiling this. Okay, so let's now run this. So before I run this, for the sake of ease of understanding, let me write something like system.out.print enter a string. That will help make things easier. So I've again compiled the program, and now let me run it. Okay. So it seems somehow this file had not been saved. So I've saved it, and I'll delete the old class file. So I'm recompiling the program, and now I'll run it. Okay, so the problem that's happening here is that we already know that only the code that's inside our main method is executed whenever we run a Java program. And since my main method is never calling this task1 method, this portion of my code never gets to be executed. So let's call my main method, let's call task1 method. And now if I recompile and run the program, it should say enter a string. So I'll just say something like hello. Okay, and as you can see, I have the output here. But what if I say something like hello world? What would happen now? Well, as you can see, I only have hello here. The text that's present after the space was not accepted as an input. So let's try something else. Let's say str something something something. So as you can see, after the space, my scanner is not taking any input. Well, the scanner class, the next method, what it does is that it reads an input until it finds an space. So now what if you want to read an entire sentence containing spaces? Well, in that case, you're going to have to use what is called the next line method. So the next line method, what it does is that it keeps on reading until it finds a line break. So now let me recompile this program. And let me rerun it. So now if I say, suppose, hello, I get the same old text. If I say hello world, I get the entire line, since there are no line breaks here. So that is basically the difference between the next and next line method, right? So now the question here is that input a word into a string and print the length of the word. So suppose in the case of hello, there were H-E-L, there are 3 characters here, L-O, and exclamation mark, there are 3 characters here. So in total, there are 6 characters. So my task is to print how many characters are there in the string input. So to do that, I have to use a method called length. So remember, I'm only going to briefly talk about this. We'll talk about this in great detail in theory classes, but anyways, in Java, string is implemented as objects. So your string is basically a data type that has already been predefined, right? So let me take a look back at the box demo here that we used previously. So in the case of box, we had a class box and we created a method called getVolume. So whenever you call the getVolume method from box, you are getting the volume of that particular box. The volume of this particular box was obtained by multiplying L into H into W, right? So in Java's built-in string class, there is a method called length. And what this length method does is that it returns the number of characters in your string. So let me save this program and now let me rerun it. Okay, enter a string. So let's say hello. And as you can see, it returns 6 characters. So if you're wondering if it checks for quotes, let's do that. So hello, and let's just write W. As you can see, it counted the extra space and the character after that as well, which is W. So in short, in Java, your strings are implemented as objects. However, one difference between string as an object and data types or classes that you create yourself is that normally when you declare an object, you had to write something like this, like suppose class name identifier equals new class name, right? This was the syntax that you were following. But with string, it's a special kind of object. So you don't need to use this new keyword anymore. You can just type the data that you want to insert. So we'll talk about why strings are handled differently in theory classes. But for our lab, just know that in Java, strings are implemented as objects. And it's a special type of object and it contains some methods. The first of which we learned is called the length method, and it returns the number of characters in a string. So with this knowledge, you should be able to do task 1. So suppose in task 1, if you enter an input, you should be able to return the number of characters in that string input. Okay. So task 2 is input a word into string, print each character on a line by itself, use char at method. So it's saying that now if you enter a string, you have to be able to print each of the lines separately. So now you're being asked to use a method called char_at. Okay, so let's take a look at the usage of char_at. So let's create another method. Let's name this task2. Okay, so let me copy and paste this here. So let me accept a string input from the user. Let's call this okay. So what does char_at do? So let me show a short demo. So suppose this was hello. So what char_at does is that it prints the character in a specific index. Suppose you wanted to know what the character at this index was. So you can think of a string as a character array. However, a character array and a string are two completely different things. But for the time being, you can interpret a string as a character array. So suppose you want to know the character that's at the first index. So you should just write 0 here. So if you run this, you'll get H here. Similarly, if you want the character at the last index, which was what? Let's see. This was 0. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the last index is the 5th. So the 6th index is actually numbered 5. So if I print this, I get an exclamation mark, which is this one here. So that is basically what the char_at method does. Well, your task is now to print each of the lines, print each of the characters in a string in separate lines. So how are we going to do that? So let us take a string input, and then since we can possibly say how long or how many characters our string input is going to have, since it is completely user dependent, let's use a for loop. So this for loop is going to run till the length of my string. Okay, so I can just write system.out.println str.char_at_i. So basically what is going to happen is that for the first index, char_at is going to have a value of 0 for the first iteration. For the second iteration, char_at is going to have a value of 1. For the third iteration, this will be a value of 2 here, and so on. So this will run until the size of the length minus 1. Okay, so let's try running task2 now. So again, I should write something like this. Enter a string. This should make things easier to understand. Okay. So enter a string. So let me write programming. And as you can see, each of my characters have been printed out in a separate line. So that is basically all you have to do for task 2. So now the question is, you're being asked to print the ASCII code. So you know, each character has a specific ASCII code. So what is an ASCII code? Well, ASCII codes are basically codes that are used to represent texts such as A, B, C, characters such as semicolon, full stops, etc. in computers. So a specific character will have a specific ASCII code value. So if you Google ASCII table, you should be able to get a table that looks like this. So it seems this is quite low resolution. Let me try a different, so it has loaded. So if you can see here, So let me zoom in here a bit. So as you can see, the character A, if I go back, so you can see the character A has an ASCII code of 65. So you should just look at the decimal values here. So these are the hex representation and total representations. You can skip them. So just look at the hex decimal representations for now. So suppose Z has an ASCII code of 90. Suppose lowercase z has an ASCII code of 112. Lowercase a has an ASCII code of 97, and so on. So there are ASCII codes for brackets as well, and many other things, as you can see from this table here. So task 3 asks you to print the ASCII code. So as you can see, the code for printing an ASCII code has already been given here. So what you need to do is first use the char method to get a character from your string. Then if you write this, you'll get the ASCII code for the specific character. So what it's doing here is casting that character to an integer. So casting is a very important topic, and we'll learn about this as well. Or if you want the shortcut method, you can just call a method that's built into the string class called quotePointAt, and it will print the ASCII value for a specific character at a specific index. So let's try that out. Let me just, so you should do task 3 on your own. I'm just going to show you the use of these two methods. Okay. Okay, so let's say I have a string called s equals to hello, right? So if I print this, I'm going to, okay, for ease of understanding, let's say I have a string called a. So what it's doing here is that it's going to get the character that's at the 0th index. In other words, it's going to get a. So a is going to be stored here in this character variable. Then that character variable is being casted to an integer, and this will result in the ASCII code being stored in code4ch, and then you can finally print it. So if I run this program, you'll see I get 65, and as you can see, the ASCII code for a is 65. So similarly, suppose if I change this to z and I print the ASCII value for 3, which is the last index, I get 90. So as you can see, the ASCII value for z is 90. Okay, so the second approach is to use a method called quotePoint. So with this method, you can eliminate these two lines. So you can just write quotePointAt, and 0 again means it will get the ASCII value of the character that's at the 0th index. So let's run this, and looks like we have a problem here, which is okay. So the problem here is that this method is going to return an ASCII value, which is an integer, but I'm trying to store that integer in a character variable. I cannot do that, so I have to just change this variable to an integer, and now again I can just have this here. Okay, so as you can see, here with just one line, I'm doing these two lines we were doing previously. So similarly, I can change this to 3, and I'll get a value of 90, as we previously saw that z has an ASCII value of 90. So that is basically task 3. Well, I'm not going to do it for you. In task 3, what you're going to have to do is that in task 2, we learned how to print each of the characters of a string input into separate lines. Well, now you're going to have to modify task 2 and print the ASCII value as well. So you should be able to modify this code inside this for loop. You should be able to print the ASCII value using either of this method. So it's up to you which one of these two you want to use. Okay, so I'll move on to question 4. Question 4 says, imagine a user will give you some numbers, say 8 numbers, and all the numbers are between 2 and 4. One program to count these numbers maybe. So basically the question here is that you'll be given 8 numbers and you're required to find out how many times each number occurs, and the range of these numbers is between 2 and 4. Okay, so let's see the program that they have written for us already. So they're creating a scanner object, and they're creating a integer array that's of size 5. Okay, so let us just copy and paste this code. Let's call this public static void task 4. So need to do a bit of formatting here to make the code eligible or readable. Okay. So what this program is doing here is that first we're creating an array of size 5 and we're declaring 2 variables I and n. Then you're giving an input, giving an output to the user that says enter total 8 numbers between 2 and 4, only otherwise I'll have to make my array larger. Okay. So basically you have a for loop here that's going to iterate 8 times. Since you have less than equals 7 and your for loop is starting at 0, and you're iterating or incrementing the starting index by just 1. So every time this for loop runs, you're going to have an input stored in a variable n. So what is this line doing? This line is basically storing the occurrence or frequency of the number that has been already entered. Okay, so I think it will be better if I express this graphically. So let me turn on screen sharing. Okay. So we want to know what this line is doing. So let's figure this out. Okay. So first let's confirm that here in this line we had created a array that's of size 5, right? So you have an array here with 5 cells. This is the 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So you have 5 cells here. Next, let's see what is happening here. So every time you're giving an input, suppose, and again know that our input range is between 2 to 4, which means your input should either be 2, 3 or 4. They have to be from any of these 3 numbers, right? So suppose if you have given an input of, suppose my first input is 4. Okay, I'll briefly stop here since the azan is being recited. Okay, it looks like the azan has been completed, so let's resume our class. Okay, so where was I? So we talked about having an array that's of size 5, and then we were on the verge of explaining what this line was doing, right? So let me just write this line here. So let me write statistics in short, for stat for short. stat in short for statistics. Okay, so n, what is n here? N is basically my input, right? So to avoid confusion, let me erase I and let me write n here. So this is going to be my input. So suppose my first input is 4. So what's going to happen is that inside this variable n, I'll have 4 here. I'll have 4 here as well. So this basically means stat 4 plus 1, right? Stat 4 equals stat 4 plus 1. So let's see what we have at stat 4. So when you declare an array in Java, initially all your array cells will have 0 as long as the array is of type integer. So the default value for an integer is 0. Okay, but what happens when you do this? So stat 4, let's see what we already have at stat 4, it's 0. So what's happening is that 0 plus 1 equals to 1. And where is this 1 going to be stored? Well, I think I should shift this to here to avoid any, okay. So let me just delete this entirely. So let me repeat. What's happening is that in stat 4 you have the value 0 and you are adding 1 to it, resulting in having 1. So this one is going to be stored again in stat 4, which contains 0. So you can erase the 0 that was here previously and you can write 1 here. So that is basically what is happening, right? So suppose your input was something like this: 4, 3, 2, 4, 2, 2, 4. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we were supposed to have 8 inputs, right? So we had completed our first input. So now suppose you have your second input, which is 3. So let's see what happens when we have 3 here. So now you would have 3 here, 3 here, 3 here, 3 here. Okay, so at index number 3 you have 0. Again you have 0 plus 1 equaling 1, and this 1 is going to be stored here. So I'll cancel out 0 and I'll place 1. So next let's do this for 3, I mean 2. So you have 2 here, 2 here. So you have basically 2 here and 2 here. So again at cell 2 you have 0. So 0 plus 1 equals 1. So this 1 is going to be stored here, right? Now finally let's see what happens when we have a 4 here. So let me erase this out. Okay. So now that I have a 4 here, I'm going to have 4 here as well, since n is basically my input. But look at stat 4, we already have a value that's not 0, which is 1. So you have 1 plus 1 this time equaling 2. So this means your previous value of 1 is going to get cancelled and replaced with a value of 2. So let's do the same for 2. As you can see, if we now have 2 here, we'll again have a value of 1 here that's going to get added to 1, and we'll have 2 here. So again, if you repeat this pattern, now at the second index number 2, you already have a 2. So let's erase this and let's try write 2 here, and now you have 3. So at the second index you'll now have 3. Okay, so this looks like a grave mistake on my part. I did not show you guys the input, so hope you were able to interpret the inputs from this. Okay, so let's try another one. Let's do this for let's do this for 4. Okay, so again, since you guys could not see, let me start 4 from scratch. So 4 is basically my input, which means 4 is basically this n here. So I'm storing my input here in n, right? So that is why I have n written here. All of these are values for n. So this 4 is going to be placed here, right? And this n is going to be replaced by 4. So what happens in this sentence is that you're going to have to first look at the index 4. So at 4, we already have a value 2, right? So you're going to want to place that value here and add it to 1. So you get 3. And where is this 3 being placed? This 3 is being placed in that same index. So in other words, the value 3 is going to get placed here. So the previous value 2 is now going to get replaced by 3. Okay. So finally, let's take a look at the last input, which was 3. So again, for 3, you'll have 4 replaced here with 3. And let's take a look at what's in cell 3. So at cell 3, you have a value of 1, which means you're going to have 1 here. 1 plus 1 is equal to 2. And 2 this time is going to get stored at index number 3. So previously you had 1, you are now going to have 2. Okay. So after basically tracing out this program, this is what your array looks like. Okay. So let me copy this here again. You had 5 cells. And the values inside were 0, 0, 3, 2, 3. Now notice here, let us ourselves count how many times 2 has occurred in our input. So as you can see, 2 has occurred here, here, and here. And note that at index 2, we have a value of 3. Now let's take a look at how many times 3 has occurred in the input. So 3 has occurred here and here. And now note, at index 3, we have a value of 2. Finally, let's take a look at how many times 4 has occurred. So 4 has occurred 3 times. So again, at index 4, we have a value of 3. So basically, what this array is doing is that it's storing the frequency of how many times each number has been given as an input. So basically, in this way, you can keep track of how many times a number has been entered. So in the end, what's happening in this for loop is that you're printing the contents of this array. So you're printing the contents of this array from 2 to 4. In other words, you're basically printing the contents that are from this index to this index. Why? Because your input was initially confined to just these 3 numbers. So you already know that you did not have any input that was 0 or 1. So in this way, you're printing the results. Okay. So now my question is there a better way to do this? Well, because if you think about it, let's say now my requirement is that the numbers that I'll give will be in the range of 97, 98, 99. Right. So this is my current requirement, that my inputs will be among any of these numbers. So now what are you going to do? Are you going to declare an array that's of size 100? Is this really an efficient way of doing it? Suppose you have the 0 index here, 1, and you have 97, 98, 99. So in total, 100 cells. So if you follow the old approach, you can obviously store how many times 97 has occurred, 98 has occurred, and 99 has occurred. by using this the old approach that we discussed previously. But however, as for these indices, they're completely being wasted, isn't it? So there are about 97 cells here. They're completely being wasted, whereas previously we were wasting only 2 cells. But now you're wasting 97 cells. So this is clearly not a viable solution. Suppose your number was in the range of this. You'd be wasting so many cells. Right. So an efficient way of doing this would be like this. Suppose, let me consider the previous example again. So basically I know that I have 3 distinct numbers that are sequential. Sequential means one after another. So 97, 98, 99. Okay. So how about, since I have just 3 numbers, why do I not declare an array of size 3? And now let me store the value, basically store how many times 97 has occurred in 0 cell, how many times 98 has occurred in index number 1, and 99 in index number 2. So how would we do that? What kind of changes would I need to make? Well, previously this was my code, that stat n equals stat n plus 1, right? This was my previous code. But here, suppose if you have declared an array that's of size 3, but you want to access an index that's 97. An index that's 97 clearly does not exist, right? So you'd get an error called Java's array index out of bounds exception. So your objective is to store 97 in 0. So how can you do that? Well, if you think about it, if you subtract 97 from n, what would you get? 0. Similarly, if the value here was 98, 98 minus 97 would be 1. Similarly, if your value was 99, 99 minus 97 would be 2. You'd have to do a similar thing here. So again, just by making this small change, you can write a much more efficient program, right? So if I were to trace a few cells, let's see how it would work. Suppose my input is like this: 97, 98, 98. So here, for the first case, okay, so I have n, which is 97, so 97 minus 97 basically is 0, and again 97 minus 97 is 0, right? So I'd have the contents of index 0 plus 1. So index 0 has what? So as I previously said, when you declare an integer array, it's populated with the default value for integer, which is 0. So in other words, you're going to have 0 plus 1 equaling 1. So you'll have 1 here. So this is 97. So let's do this for 98. So 98 minus 97 and 98 minus 97. So this is 1 and this is 1. So now let's take a look at the value at index 1. So at index 1, you have 0 here. So again, you'll have 0 plus 1 equals to 1. And this 1 will be placed in the placed in index 1. So you have 1. And again you have 98. So again, if you do this subtraction, you'll have 1 here and 1 here, right? So just to be clear, these are the index numbers. However, this time in index number 1, you already have 1. So 1 plus 1 equals 2. So you'll have a 2 here. So after the end of this program, if you look at this array, you can see that 97 has occurred only once, 98 has occurred twice, which is represented here. And since 99 was not entered even once, you have a 0 here. So in this way, you can basically store how many times a number has been entered by a user as long as there is a range. So how is this important for this lab? Now let's take a look at that. Well, you see, in this question, you are being asked to take an input from the user and then find out how many times that letter has occurred and its ASCII value. So as you can see, A in Bangladesh occurs once here and once here, 2 times. So your objective is to print first A followed by its ASCII code and how many times it has been found. So as you can see, Bangladesh has no C in it, right? So for the case of C, you can say it was found 0 times and its ASCII value is 67 times. So you are going to now need to combine the knowledge that you've been given in the previous tasks, where you learned how to say firstly, you learned how to find the length of a string, then you learned how to find the specific character of a string, then you learned how to find the ASCII value for that character. And then in the last example, I showed you how to use a method to store the number of times a number has been entered efficiently. So how you're going to do this is up to you. Okay, so finally, task 5 is basically a concatenation program. So it's basically saying that you should try to concatenate 2 strings. So let me just show a very brief example of this. So suppose you have a string S1 equals ABC and you have a string S2 equals DEF. So you can concatenate these 2 strings using the plus operator. Okay, so if I print this, I'll get ABCDEF. So let's try this. And looks like there's a problem here, which is that I should have written S2 here. So anyways, as you can see, I've been given the concatenated version of it. So this is basically what you are required to do in task 5. So task 6 will require similar knowledge. So for task 6, what I want you to do is that Java's string class has a number of methods. So I want you to just look up these methods and find out what each of them do. So it should not be a difficult thing to do. You should be able to figure this out yourselves. And if you can, you should test them out as well. So again, task number 4 may look challenging at first, but it is very easy if you've understood the concepts that I've explained. And if you have any questions regarding this task 4, you can obviously ask me at the live session. So with that, I'll end today's pre-recorded lecture.